My name is Gracie Jones, and I want to ask you a question before we even get into the coffee in front of us. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who have known you since you were in diapers and watched them collectively decide that you no longer exist? Not just that they disagree with you or that they are angry with you, but that your entire humanity has been scrubbed clean from their ledger. It's a very specific kind of cold. It's the kind of cold that stays in your marrow for nearly a decade, no matter how many warm summers you live through afterward. If you've ever had to learn how to breathe again after your own bloodline took the air right out of your lungs, just pull up a chair. You are exactly who I am talking to today. If you know what it means to protect your peace at all costs, do me a quick favor and type the word boundaries in the comments right now. I want to see how many of us have had to build our own walls just to keep our souls intact. Let's go back to August 20th, 2017, Springfield, Illinois. It was a Sunday, because of course it was. In my father's world, every major destruction had to have a spiritual cover story. Wallace Jones was not just my father. He was a senior elder at First Cornerstone Community Church, a sprawling, non-denominational fortress of a building where 320 people hung on his every word. That morning, I was sitting in the third pew from the back. I remember counting the light fixtures on the ceiling. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 24. That's what my body does when it knows a storm is coming. It counts things. It looks for order in a room that is about to become entirely chaotic. My father didn't look at me during the opening hymns. He didn't look at me during the announcements. He was adjusting his navy blue silk tie, a gesture he had been repeating like a nervous tic for 3 straight days. Beside him, my mother, Diane, sat with her hands folded tightly into what looked like a bird's nest in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the patterned carpet. She knew. Of course she knew. When the sermon was supposed to start, Reverend Whitfield didn't open his Bible. Instead, he stepped to the side of the polished oak pulpit and invited the elder board forward for what he called a matter of profound community concern. My father stepped up alone, holding a single, folded piece of white paper. He didn't put on his reading glasses. He wanted the entire congregation to look directly into his eyes. He wanted them to see the performance of a holy man carrying a heavy cross. "We raised this girl in truth." His voice boomed through the sound system, bouncing off the stained glass windows my own great-grandfather had paid for back in 1962. She chose deception. She chose to forge academic documents and steal a prestigious teaching scholarship that belonged to an honorable legacy. And now she intends to take her place among innocent children. The silence in that sanctuary was heavy, almost suffocating. Nobody gasped. In a church like ours, when a senior elder corrects someone from the pulpit, it isn't viewed as a scandal. It's viewed as a public service. It's viewed as a cleaning of the temple. Then he opened the paper and read 3 short sentences. "I don't know if I believe anymore. God feels like a locked door. I am completely broken." He read the word broken twice, letting it hang in the humid August air. Those sentences were mine. They were fragments of a deeply private, agonizing spiritual reflection I had written for a youth group assignment back in 2010, weeks after my grandfather passed away. I was 16 years old when I poured my heart into that sealed envelope. I thought I was giving it to a youth pastor I could trust. I didn't know that my older sister, Chloe, had made a photocopy of it 7 years prior. She had kept it in her desk drawer, like an assassin keeping a bullet, just waiting for the exact moment it would do the most maximum damage. My father folded the paper, looked directly over the heads of the crowd, and delivered the final blow. "My daughter is mentally unstable. She is dangerous. For the safety of our community, she should never be allowed near children." 4 rows ahead of me, Chloe turned around. She didn't look angry. She gave me her practiced, public smile, the one where her chin dips down just a few degrees. Her eyes widen with artificial pity, and the corners of her mouth twitch back just enough to look sympathetic to the people watching her. My mother didn't move a muscle. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My body went entirely numb, a clean shock-induced anesthesia. I stood up, my knees locking into place, and walked out the heavy side door of the sanctuary into the blinding 91-degree afternoon heat. I had exactly $280 in cash in my pocket, tips I had saved all summer from serving lattes to the local Rotary Club at the Blue Door coffee shop on the east side. I had one gray canvas backpack on my shoulders containing 3 changes of clothes, a paperback copy of Wuthering Heights, and a water bottle. I didn't know it then, but as that heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, an 8-year clock began to tick. I was walking into the wild, terrifying unknown of a new life, entirely erased by the people who gave me my name. But here is the thing about being buried alive by your family. They always forget that you are a seed. They think they are hiding a shameful secret, but they are actually just giving you the soil you need to grow into someone they will never, ever be able to control. If you have ever had to leave everything you knew in a single afternoon, you know that trauma has a very specific smell. For me, it was the heavy, suffocating scent of diesel fuel and stale, salted pretzels. That's the olfactory signature of the Greyhound station on East Adams Street. It took me exactly 1 hour and 13 minutes to walk there from my father's driveway. The sun was beating down so hard on the asphalt that I could feel the heat radiating right through the thin soles of my sneakers. My gray backpack felt like it was filled with lead, but inside it was mostly empty space. Just a few rolled-up shirts, my old paperback, and a small black USB drive I had grabbed from my desk drawer in those final frantic minutes before walking out. The ticket clerk behind the scratched plexiglass window had a thick, beige mustache stained with coffee. He didn't even look up at me when I approached. He just tapped his fingers against the counter. "Where to?" he muttered, his voice flat. "Boston," I said. My voice sounded incredibly thin, like paper that had been left out in the rain. "One way, please." He punched a few keys on a dusty terminal that looked like it belonged in the 90s. "Springfield to Boston isn't a straight shot, kid. You're looking at Springfield to Chicago, Chicago to Cleveland, Cleveland to Albany, and then Albany to Boston South Station. 26 hours, 4 different buses, 3 transfers. You want it or not?" "I want it," I said. The ticket cost exactly $89. When he handed me my change, I slid the remaining cash back into the deep pocket of my jeans. I had less than $200 left to my name, no place to sleep, and absolutely no one waiting for me at the other end of that line. But as I sat down on the hard plastic bench in the terminal, waiting for the 5:42 bus to Chicago, a strange sense of clarity started to wash over me. For 23 years, I had lived in a house where my worth was measured entirely by how well I fell into formation. If I smiled when Chloe needed to look superior, I was a good sister. If I kept my mouth shut when my father twisted the truth from the pulpit, I was a dutiful daughter. Walking away didn't feel like a victory yet. It felt like bleeding out, but at least it was my own blood on the floor. Have you ever noticed how the universe will sometimes send you exactly what you need right when you are completely convinced you are invisible? Somewhere between Cleveland and Albany, the bus became entirely quiet. Most of the passengers were asleep, their heads knocking gently against the cold glass windows as the vehicle drifted down the dark interstate. At a small rest stop in Ohio, a woman got on and took the empty seat right next to me. Her name was Miss Odessa. She was 71 years old, a retired postal worker from Detroit, who was on her way to see her grandson start his freshman year at UMass Amherst. She wore a bright plaid coat and carried a heavy thermos of tea between her knees. She didn't say anything to me for the first hour. She just watched the way my hands were gripping the straps of my backpack, knuckles completely white, trying so hard to hold myself together that I was barely breathing. Finally, she unsnapped a faded Tupperware container on her lap. Inside was a thick chicken sandwich cut perfectly in half, 2 hard-boiled eggs, and a $5 bill folded twice, tucked neatly underneath the food. She didn't ask if I was hungry. She just placed the entire container onto my lap and closed her warm, wrinkled hands directly over mine. "Eat, baby," she whispered, her voice like warm velvet in the chilly, air-conditioned bus. "You're far too thin to be trying to be this brave." I didn't cry when my father called me dangerous in front of 300 people. I didn't cry when my mother watched him do it. But when that total stranger gave me half her lunch on a dark highway in the middle of the night, the tears finally came. I sat there in the dim light of the Greyhound bus, chewing on a chicken sandwich, crying silently so I wouldn't wake up the rest of the passengers. Miss Odessa didn't ask me what happened. She didn't pry. She just kept her hand on my wrist until we hit the state line. By the time the bus finally pulled into Boston South Station on Tuesday afternoon, the heat wave had followed me all the way east. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of exhaust and warm ocean water. I had one specific address written on a scrap of paper, the Beacon Educator Fellowship Office at Boston College in Chestnut Hill. But it was already past 5 o'clock when I arrived, and the offices were locked for the night. I walked until my legs couldn't carry me anymore, ending up on the massive granite steps of the Boston Public Library in Copley Square. The city was moving around me in a blur of color, cyclists weaving through traffic, tourists taking photos of Trinity Church, a street musician playing a violin badly across the plaza. I sat on those steps all night, hugging my gray backpack to my chest like a shield. I didn't sleep a single wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the echo of my father's voice through the church speakers. At 3:14 in the morning, a Boston police cruiser slowed down by the fountain. An officer got out, his heavy utility belt clicking as he walked over to where I was sitting. My heart leaped into my throat. I braced myself to be told to move along, to be treated like trash just like I had been back home. He stopped a few feet away, his hands resting casually on his vest. He looked at my backpack, then down at my dusty shoes, and finally at the way my hands were trembling. "You doing okay out here, ma'am?" he asked gently. "I'm just waiting for the library to open, sir," I whispered. "I have an appointment in the morning." He nodded slowly, assessing the situation. He didn't demand my ID. He didn't raise his voice. "It gets pretty cold before dawn. Tell you what, I'm going to be looping back around this block every hour. You want me to come check on you around 6, just to make sure you're safe." "That would be really nice, sir," I said. He gave me a brief nod, said, "All right then, hang in there," and walked back to his car. I watched his taillights disappear down Boylston Street. It was the first time in my entire life that a man in a position of authority had looked at me and asked what I needed, rather than demanding to know what I owed him. Sitting on those cold stone steps, looking out at the dark plaza, I realized that Springfield was already starting to lose its grip on me. The lie they had told about me was local. The world outside was much, much bigger than Wallace Jones's church. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked the 4.1 miles from the library steps to Chestnut Hill. My joints were stiff from the concrete, and my clothes felt dusty. But when I stepped into the Beacon Educator Fellowship office, the air conditioning hit my face like a clean slate. I laid my cream-colored award letter on the desk of the assistant director, a woman named Clara, who had silver hair and wore a sharp green blazer. She looked at the letter, then looked up at my bloodshot eyes and my gray backpack. She didn't ask why I looked like I had spent the night on the street. Instead, she reached into her desk drawer, pulled out a small plastic key card, and slid it across the desk toward me. "This is for the graduate guest housing in Campus Center," she said, her voice steady and entirely devoid of judgment. "It's yours for the next 5 days while we finalize your registration. Your master's program starts in 2 weeks. Miss Jones, your Uncle James spoke highly of what an educator should be. Looking at your transcripts, I can see you share that same fire. Welcome to Boston College." I took that key card, and when I got to the small white-walled dorm room, I didn't even unpack. I lay down on the twin bed with my shoes still on, opened my composition notebook, and wrote 4 words on the very first page: "I do not go back." Then I fell into the deepest, most dreamless sleep I had experienced in years. Boston didn't become mine overnight. It became mine by inches, and the very first inch was a quiet bookstore on Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge called Callahan Booksellers. 2 weeks after I arrived, I walked past its wide front window and saw a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Help wanted. Must know the alphabet. No music allowed. When I walked inside, a brass bell above the door rang low and slow. The shop smelled of crumbling paper, old leather, and floor wax. Standing behind the massive oak counter was Peter Callahan. He was 54 years old, wore a faded brown wool cardigan despite the lingering September heat, and was manually shelving a stack of used novels without a computer in sight. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "Do you read every day?" he asked, skipping any formal introduction. "Yes," I said. "Can you shelf alphabetically for 6 hours straight without putting headphones in your ears?" "I prefer the quiet, Peter." He paused, his eyes lingering on the word Peter. He hadn't told me his name yet, but he had a small brass nameplate sitting next to an old cash register. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. $12 an hour, he said, turning back to his books. 25 hours a week. I don't tolerate rudeness to customers, even when they deserve it. You start right now. For the next 3 years, Callahan Booksellers became my sanctuary. While my days were consumed by teaching 8th grade English at Roxbury Preparatory Charter School, and my nights were buried in graduate seminars at Boston College, Peter's shop was the place where I learned how to exist without defending myself. Peter was a man of few words, but he possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of people who were trying to rebuild themselves from the studs up. He never asked about my family, but every Friday night when I closed the register, there would be a fresh loaf of sourdough bread or a small bag of groceries waiting for me on the back counter. He was the first man who ever gave me safety without asking what I owed him for it. The schedule I kept was brutal. I lived in a tiny, drafty studio apartment in Somerville where the radiator clanked like a dying machine all winter long. My diet consisted almost entirely of brown rice, black beans, and day-old pastries Peter let me take from the shop. I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. I didn't go home for Christmas. While my peers packed their bags and talked about their family's holiday traditions, I spent those empty weeks sitting in the quiet corner of Callahan's, reading by the light of a single floor lamp. In March of 2019, during my second year of graduate school, a crack appeared in the wall I had built. I was sitting on the concrete steps outside the library when my phone buzzed. It was an email notification sent to an old, semi-abandoned Yahoo account I had forgotten to delete. The subject line was just 2 words: Dad's health. I opened it. It was from Chloe. Dad had a major heart scare last night at the church board meeting. He's stable, but the doctors say the stress is killing him. Come home, Gracie. Stop this ridiculous punishment. We've already forgiven you. My chest tightened so fast I couldn't get air into my lungs. The concrete beneath me felt like it was shifting. My hands shook so violently, the phone slipped from my fingers and clattered down the stone steps. The psychological ghost of Springfield had reached across 3,000 miles to wrap its fingers around my throat. I stumbled inside the library, desperate for a place to hide, and collapsed onto a wooden bench outside. The main reading room, my head between my knees, trying desperately to remind myself how to breathe. Breathe from your belly, young lady, and then you are going to tell me exactly who died. I looked up, tears blurring my vision. Sitting next to me was an older woman with a fierce, aristocratic nose and a large tortoiseshell clip holding back her thick gray hair. She wore a heavy knit cardigan and was carrying a stack of Emily Dickinson biographies that looked heavy enough to break a table. Her name was Dr. Vivian Ashcraft. She had taught English literature at Harvard Extension for over 3 decades, and she possessed the kind of no-nonsense authority that you simply could not argue with. I sat on that bench, and, for the first time in 2 years, the entire story spilled out of me. I told her about the pulpit The forged scholarship accusation, the youth group letter, and the email currently sitting on my phone screen. She listened to every single word without interrupting once, her sharp eyes tracking the movement of my hands. When I finally ran out of words, she stood up, adjusted her book stack, and looked down at me. "You are going to come across the street right now, and you are going to eat a hot bowl of mushroom soup while I explain to you why that email is an act of emotional terrorism. Move your feet, Gracie. We have work to do." Dr. Vivian became the mother my own mother never had the courage to be. Every Friday morning for the next 7 years, we met at the same small coffee shop on Commonwealth Avenue. She didn't just help me refine my thesis. She helped me refine my boundaries. She taught me that guilt is the tool mediocre people use to force extraordinary people back into boxes that no longer fit them. "You are not surviving anymore, Gracie," she told me one rainy morning, sliding a napkin across the table where she had written the word "Sover Igeen" in thick black ink. "You are building. Say the word out loud. Let it feel heavy in your mouth." I looked at the napkin, then out the window at the bustling Boston street. "Sovereign," I whispered, and for the first time since I got off that Greyhound bus, the panic in my chest didn't come back. By the spring of 2022, the quiet life I had built began to transform into something much larger. I graduated with my master's in education and founded Second Chapter Boston, a nonprofit dedicated to providing transitional housing, education, and deep psychological support for young people who had been excommunicated or cast out by fundamentalist families. We started in a tiny basement office with a first-year budget of $92,000, 3 staff members, and 14 students who looked exactly like I did when I got off that bus. In June of 2024, I stood on a circular red stage in a simple black cardigan and delivered a 12-minute TEDx Boston talk titled what they called "Silence Was Just My Voice Being Buried." I didn't mention my father's name. I didn't name First Cornerstone Community Church or even the state of Illinois. I kept it purely systemic. I closed the talk with a single observation. The people who bury you do not know what you are. They only know what they are burying. I thought the video would sit in a dusty corner of the internet, but the algorithm has a strange way of hunting down hidden truths. By December of 2024, it hit 1 million views. By the fall of 2025, it had crossed 4.2 million. That viral momentum caught the attention of an editor at Riverhead Books, an imprint of Penguin Random House, who offered me a $180,000 contract for a memoir detailing the philosophy behind Second Chapter. The formal industry announcement went live on Publishers Marketplace on November 15th, 2025. I was sitting in my Somerville apartment, editing a chapter, completely unaware that across the country, my success had just triggered a massive crisis in an entirely different kind of business. To understand what happened next, you have to look at my older sister, Chloe. While I was spending 8 years learning how to survive on $12 an hour at a used bookstore, Chloe had been building a lucrative digital empire. For 4.5 years, she had run a highly curated Christian lifestyle Instagram account called @RootedDandradient. If you've ever scrolled through social media, you know the exact aesthetic I'm talking about. It was all filtered linen clothing, flawlessly proofed loaves of sourdough bread sitting on white marble countertops, matching pastel outfits for her 2 children, and beautifully staged prayer corners featuring leather-bound Bibles and expensive soy candles. Her captions were masterclasses in performative humility, long, flowing paragraphs about submission, building a home where the Lord can dwell, and the sanctity of a quiet, obedient life. At her peak, Chloe had 91,230 followers. But behind the soft lighting and the holy captions, the cold, hard numbers of the digital marketplace were shifting. According to metrics that would later surface, Chloe's engagement rate had been tanking by 34% every single quarter for the last 6 months. The internet was getting tired of perfect, unblemished holiness. Audiences wanted raw narrative. They wanted struggle. They wanted drama. 3 weeks before my book announcement sent shockwaves through our extended social media circles, a high-tier talent agent named Rebecca Marrow, representing a multi-million-dollar Christian lifestyle brand called Grace and Grain, approached Chloe with a massive opportunity. It was a sponsorship deal worth $58,000. For a micro-influencer whose engagement was dying, that kind of money was life-changing. It meant validation. It meant her brand survived. But the contract came with a strict, non-negotiable contingency. The brand didn't want more pictures of bread. They wanted a narrative arc. They wanted a high-impact, multi-platform campaign for the second quarter of 2026. The talent agency had even given it a title, The Prodigal Sister Returns. The plan was highly calculated. Chloe was supposed to document a deeply emotional, faith-fueled reconciliation with a long-lost, estranged family member. The only problem? Chloe didn't have a prodigal sister who had ever agreed to return. She had an empty space where I used to be, a sister she had spent 7 years helping our father paint as a dangerous, unstable thief. Then, on a Sunday afternoon in mid-March, my 87-year-old grandmother, Eleanor, who was living at the Cedar Grove Senior Living Center in Springfield, went out to an Applebee's with my parents and Chloe. Nana Eleanor was sharp, but her boundaries were failing. She looked across the table at my father and said, "Wallace, honey, Gracie's on the television now." My father tried to shut it down instantly, but the damage was done. That exact night, at 9:42 p.m., Chloe sat on her green velvet sofa in Bloomington, Illinois, opened her iPhone, and typed my name into a search bar. Within 52 minutes, she had found everything. She found the TEDx talk. She found the second chapter Boston website. She found the publisher's marketplace book announcement. And most importantly, she found the public program for the Boston Public Library's Reclaiming Voices Symposium, scheduled for Saturday, May 9th, 2026, an event where I was listed as the keynote speaker. Chloe didn't see a sister who had survived trauma. She saw a lifeline for her failing business. She turned to her husband, Nathan, that very night, and whispered the words that would set the next 24 hours on fire. "She's the story. She doesn't even know she's the story yet." If you have ever been hunted down by a family member, not because they miss your face, but because your pain has suddenly become profitable to them, you know the absolute nausea that comes with seeing their name flash on your screen. Type the word "wanted" in the comments if you've ever had to learn the hard way that there is a massive difference between a family wanting you and a family wanting to use you. It was a Saturday night, April 11th, 2026, when the dam finally broke. I was sitting at the wooden kitchen island in my Cambridge apartment, finishing up the final edits for Chapter 12 of my memoir, completely wrapped in the soft, protective silence of the life I had so carefully put together piece by piece. The clock on the microwave read exactly 11:04 p.m., when the first vibration rattled the marble counter. I reached out and flipped the phone over. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen. A text message from an unrecognized number, though the area code was instantly familiar. I slid my thumb across the glass. "Sweetheart, it's Chloe. I know it's been years. Can we talk?" I stared at that word, sweetheart. It was the exact same linguistic currency she used on her Instagram captions to pacify her followers. It felt incredibly strange, almost grotesque, seeing it directed at me after nearly a decade of absolute ice. I didn't reply. I placed the phone face down on the counter and forced my eyes back to the laptop screen, trying to drag my mind back to the structure of my chapter. But the digital ghost of Springfield was not going to be ignored. Within the next 24 hours, my phone didn't just buzz. It experienced a literal waterfall of notifications. The machine grew hot to the touch. Chloe sent 4 separate text messages between 11:04 p.m. and midnight, her language escalating from casual warmth to a highly polished, desperate urgency. At midnight exactly, the tone shifted into a command wrapped in a plea: "Come back home. We miss you so much." Then, at 12:30 a.m., my mother started calling. Diane Jones, the woman who hadn't uttered my name or dialed my number in 7.5 years, called 3 times in the dead of night. She left 3 voicemails. Her voice sounded fragile, thin, and carefully rehearsed, always ending with the exact same 3-word mantra, "Come back home." When I didn't answer the voice calls, she switched to text messages. 6 distinct blocks of text flooding in between one lie A. M and 3:15 a.m., each one terminating in that identical haunting refrain, "Come back home." By 6:15 the next morning, my grandmother's number appeared. Nana Eleanor didn't know how to text. Her fingers were too stiff, her eyes too tired to navigate the small digital keyboard. She left a single voicemail. Her voice was deeply cracked with age, carrying a heavy weight of grief that made my throat tighten up instantly. "Please come back home, honey, please." But the true claustrophobia set in between noon and 3 o'clock that Sunday afternoon. It was as if a silent alarm had been tripped inside the family network. 14 other people I used to share holidays with suddenly materialized inside my inbox. 2 aunts, 3 uncles, 4 cousins. Even my father's brother-in-law from his second marriage, a man I had literally met only 3 times. When I was a small child, sent a long, paragraphs-deep message about the beauty of familial restoration. Even Reverend Douglas Whitfield, now long retired from the pulpit where my public execution had taken place, sent a beautifully phrased letter through a text app, his prose gentle, holy, and entirely writing on behalf of my father's interests. And of course, my mother's best friend from her Tuesday morning Bible study, Loretta Perkins, chimed in to remind me that life was too short to harbor bitterness. Every single one of those 24 messages ended with the exact same 3 words: "Come back home." It was a synchronized, highly strategic campaign. It was an army falling into a perfect, uniform formation to march against my boundaries. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted a surrender. But out of the 27 messages that crowded my screen by 9:30 that morning, 3 stood completely apart. They came from an area code prefix, 309, that belonged to Peoria and the country north of it, not the Springfield bubble where my parents lived. The first one arrived at 7:22 a.m., "I believe you." The second at 8:56 a.m., "I know what she's doing." The third at 10:31 a.m., "Please don't come back yet. I have something to show you." I sat at my kitchen island, looking at those 3 anomalous lines of text. The rest of the family was reading from a script that Chloe had undoubtedly written for them. But this unknown number was speaking a language of pure, unadorned truth. It was the first time in 24 hours that I felt the cold panic leave my body, replaced by a sharp, calculating curiosity. The game had changed, and someone inside their own fortress was quietly handing me the keys to the gate. By 10 that Sunday morning, my apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a command center under siege. I couldn't look at the screen anymore, so I called Naomi Bellwood. Naomi had been my roommate in graduate school, the woman who had held my hand through the lean years of eating plain, white rice, and styling my graduation cap in the wrong order because I had no family there to help me set it straight. She was a brilliant data analyst, and, more importantly, she was the sister I should have been born with. She arrived at my place in exactly 40 minutes, carrying 2 iced lattes and her laptop. We sat cross-legged at the kitchen island, the bright April sun cutting through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble counter. Naomi didn't say a word at first. She just pulled my phone toward her and read through every single one of those 27 messages. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. When she reached the end, her fingers hovered over the last 3 messages from that unknown 309 area code. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, professional curiosity. "Gracie," she said, tapping the glass, "the people writing these first 24 messages are reading from a corporate script. They're using PR language disguised as holiness. But these last 3? This isn't an adult. Look at the syntax. Look at the punctuation. This is a kid." My heart did a strange, heavy flip in my chest. I reached out, took the phone back, and typed 2 words into the chat box. Who is this? We waited. 12 minutes passed in absolute suffocating silence. Then the 3 small gray dots appeared on the screen, dancing for what felt like an eternity before the text finally came through. I'm Sophie, Chloe's daughter. I'm 15. I've been watching your TEDx talk for 8 months now. Aunt Gracie, I think my mom is going to hurt you online. I have proof. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred together. Sophie, my sister's eldest child. A girl I had never met, whose face I had only ever seen through heavily filtered, color-coordinated Instagram portraits on a lifestyle feed. I had been entirely erased from her history, told she didn't even know I existed. Yet, here she was, reaching across the digital divide from inside the very house built on my destruction. The next afternoon, at exactly 2:15 p.m., Sophie sat down at the desk in her bedroom in Peoria, Illinois, and initiated a FaceTime call. When her face appeared on my laptop screen, my throat tightened so hard I couldn't swallow. She wore an oversized gray hoodie from Peoria Central High School with cracked white lettering, her long brown hair pulled back into a messy bun. But it was her face, her quiet, careful mouth, and the sharp, observational way her eyes moved that made my breath catch. She didn't look like Chloe at all. She looked exactly like her father, Ryan, a man who had been cast out of the family inner circle years ago. Hi, Aunt Gracie, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry no one ever told me about you. I'm sorry too, Sophie, I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. You don't need to apologize for things the adults did before you were old enough to speak. She nodded once, a mature, serious gesture that felt far too heavy for a 15-year-old shoulder. Can I show you something? I have a Google Drive folder. There are 52 items in it. I titled it Rooted and Radiant Reality. For the next 2 hours, my niece systematically dismantled the pristine, holy illusion of my sister's digital empire, piece by piece, bite by bite. She shared her screen and walked us through the digital architecture of a lie. Item number 1 was a massive archive of Photoshop layers dating back to the summer of 2023. Sophie showed us how Chloe had been digitally altering her own waistline in every single kitchen photo, thinning her body to fit the toxic aesthetic of a flawless, serene homemaker. But it grew worse. By winter of 2024, Chloe had started using those same tools on Sophie, digitally altering the legs and bodies of her own children in family portraits to maintain the brand's visual standard of perfection. Then came item number 4. A series of explicit email exchanges between Chloe and Rebecca Marrow, the talent agent from Grace and Grain. The most recent thread, dated March 5th, 2026, laid out the full strategy for the $58,000 contract. They had mapped out the entire reunion like a television episode. One email from Chloe practically made my blood run cold. She had written, "We're going to need her physical presence at a public event for the final payoff shot. The brand requires a high-impact visual of the embrace. That's what will make the campaign go viral." They didn't want my forgiveness. They wanted a photo asset for a corporate quarterly report. They wanted a commercial. Sophie's voice through the speakers remained small, flat, and chillingly precise as she kept scrolling through the digital records. But it was item 49 that caused the room to tilt completely sideways. It was a folder containing an archived data download from Meta that Chloe had requested back in 2020 and carelessly left sitting on an old, unencrypted laptop in the basement. Inside was a Facebook Messenger conversation from October 11th, 2010. Chloe was 20 years old at the time of the chat. She was talking to her best friend, Rachel Calloway. The timestamp on the text read exactly 9:37 p.m. Chloe, I found Gracie's crisis journal in her desk. Weird church stuff about doubt, saving pages for later. Dad might need this one day. She's such a target. Rachel, lol, why? Chloe, because. Sophie looked at me through the screen, her dark eyes completely steady. She was 20, Aunt Gracie. She had already decided to destroy you before you even finished high school. She didn't find that letter by accident in 2017. She had it waiting in a folder for 7 years. I sat perfectly still, my hand pressed flat against the cool marble of my kitchen island, just to keep my body anchored to the floor. For nearly a decade, I had carried the paralyzing weight of thinking my own spiritual struggles had brought that public execution on my head. I thought my honesty had made me dangerous. But looking at that blue text box on the screen, the guilt didn't just fade, it vanished completely, replaced by a cold, sharp mathematical calculation. It was never about my sins. It was about their strategy. "Sophie," I said softly, keeping my voice entirely clear so she wouldn't feel the need to protect me. "What were you planning to do with all of this?" "I wrote a script," she said, lifting a piece of notebook paper into the camera's view. "I was going to make an 8-minute YouTube video and post it on the day she launched her campaign. My dad said I could do it if I wanted to. He said he wouldn't stop me anymore." Sophie's father, Ryan Whitaker, was a 42-year-old HVAC repair technician who lived on the south side of Peoria. He had spent 10 years watching his marriage turn into a commercial enterprise, watching his children being treated like content production units, before he finally signed the divorce papers in 2019. He had watched my TEDx talk in December after Sophie made him sit down in his garage to view it, and according to my niece, he had sat on his work stool and cried into his hands for 20 minutes afterward. "Put your dad on the phone, Sophie," I requested. When Ryan's face appeared on the screen, he looked like a man who spent his life around machinery and men who didn't talk about their feelings. He had a heavy jaw and tired, deeply creased eyes. "Ryan," I said, leaning in toward the microphone, "if I invite Sophie to Boston to sit in the front row of my book symposium on May 9th, and I invite you to come with her, will you drive her down here?" He cleared his throat, a low, gravelly sound. "Gracie, I've been waiting 8 long years for someone in that family to tell the goddamn truth. I didn't think it would be my own daughter leading the charge, but if she wants to be in that room, I'll drive her through the night to get her there." I looked back at Sophie. "You should not have to carry your mother's secrets alone anymore, sweetheart. But if you are ready, you can be a part of my story now." She nodded once, a small, clean movement. "Okay." Meanwhile, back in Bloomington, Illinois, my sister was preparing for the performance of her career. Believing her silence was working, she sent me 4 more text messages over the next 3 weeks. One mentioned a sudden flare-up of our mother's chronic back pain. Another included a beautifully lit photograph of 4 candles burning in her prayer corner, captioned "Believing for You." On April 24th, she posted a highly produced video on her Instagram story, captioned "Prayer for the Prodigal Ones this week," which pulled in over 12,000 views from her remaining followers. She booked her Delta flight to Boston Logan. She bought a $148 white linen blouse from Anthropologie for the occasion. She told her corporate contact at Grace and Grain that she was going to publicly embrace her estranged sister in front of a live audience and that it was going to be an algorithmic explosion. She thought she was setting a trap. She had no idea that for 3.5 weeks, my editor, Amelia Hartford, Naomi, and I had been editing a 12-minute keynote address with surgical precision. On May 8th, I walked over to the black filing cabinet in the corner of the second chapter office, pulled out a thumb drive containing 3 encrypted PDF files of Chloe's corporate emails and meta archives, and slid it into the inside pocket of my navy blazer. Type the word "strategy" in the comments right now if you know what it means to stop reacting emotionally to the people who hurt you and start preparing your boundaries in absolute, beautiful silence. The morning of Saturday, May 9th, 2026, arrived with a low, heavy fog drifting off the harbor, wrapping the granite columns of Copley Square in a cold, damp shroud. I stood in front of the mirror in my Cambridge apartment, adjusting the collar of my navy blazer. My fingers were completely steady. I reached into my bag, took out the black thumb drive containing the encrypted digital archives, and slid it safely into my inside breast pocket. I didn't know if I would have to use it, But as Dr. Vivian had taught me, a sovereign life means never showing up to a battlefield completely unarmed. The Boston Public Library's central building was constructed in 1895, a gorgeous, echoing monument of sandstone, marble, and history. Rab Hall, located on the lower level, was built for academic lectures, meaning its acoustics were mathematically designed to carry a normal human voice to the very back row without the need for artificial amplification. By 1:30 p.m., all 350 ticketed attendees had filed into the room, filling the long wooden benches with their green cushions. The atmosphere was electric. The panel was titled Rewriting the Family Story, and I was scheduled to speak last. Chloe and her husband, Nathan, had checked in through general admission at 1:14 p.m. From my vantage point behind the stage curtain, I watched them find their seats in row 8, right off the center aisle. Chloe was radiant in her $148 white anthropology blouse, her hair curled into flawless, media-ready waves. Nathan was already unzipping his canvas messenger bag, subtly adjusting the small iPhone gimbal and checking the battery indicator on his GoPro Hero. They were blocking out the scene. They were getting ready for the payoff shot. What they didn't see, however, was that at 1:19 p.m., Ryan and Sophie Whitaker had checked in under Ryan's name. They had quietly taken their seats in row 3 on the far left side, completely outside of Chloe's line of sight. Sophie wore a simple pair of jeans and an oversized oatmeal-colored cardigan. She sat with a small blue USB drive tightly gripped in her palm, her face an unreadable mask of pure determination. At exactly 2:05 p.m., the moderator stepped to the podium. Please welcome our final keynote speaker, G. Marie Jones, founder of Second Chapter Boston. The room erupted in warm applause as I stepped onto the stage. I stood behind the microphone, looked out over the sea of faces, and began my 12-minute talk. I didn't yell. I didn't lean into theatrical drama. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a woman who had spent 8 years analyzing the mechanics of her own survival. I spoke about a young girl who had been publicly stripped of her dignity at a church pulpit, branded a thief and a liar to cover up a generational secret. I detailed how institutions use the language of holiness to isolate and dismantle anyone who dares to point out the rot in the foundation. And then, looking directly down the center aisle toward row 8, I delivered the line we had spent weeks anchoring into the text. They told a room of 300 people that I was dangerous to children, I said, letting the words hang in the heavy silence of Rab Hall. I spent 8 years believing that my brokenness was a biohazard. But safety isn't something you inherit from people who require your silence. So, I built Second Chapter, a place designed specifically to harbor children they had already broken. The applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't polite. It was a visceral, standing ovation that rolled through the hall like thunder. As the noise began to taper off, Chloe seized her moment. She stood up in row 8, tears already streaming down her face with flawless timing part 8. The reclaiming of Rab Hall, clean payoff. The morning of Saturday, May 9th, 2026, arrived with a low, heavy fog drifting off the harbor and settling into the granite creases of Copley Square. The Boston Public Library's central building, a massive Renaissance Revival fortress built in 1895, felt incredibly solid beneath my feet. I stood in the green room downstairs, adjusting the cuffs of my navy blazer. My hands weren't shaking anymore. In the inside pocket, the small black thumb drive felt heavy against my ribs, but my mind was completely focused on the front row. By 1:30 p.m., the 350 ticketed attendees had filed into Rab Hall, their voices creating a low, rhythmic hum that echoed off the high ceilings. They took their seats on the long wooden benches with green cushions. The panel was called Rewriting the Family Story, and because of the viral momentum of my TEDx talk, I was scheduled to speak last. The library had also set up a multi-camera live stream on their YouTube channel, which already had several thousand people waiting in the chat box. I watched from the side curtain as Chloe and Nathan checked in through general admission at 1:14 p.m. My sister looked immaculate. She wore her $148 white Anthropologie blouse, her hair curled into soft, camera-ready waves. Nathan was carrying a canvas messenger bag, and I could see the metallic glint of a GoPro Hero and a small phone gimbal peeking out from the zipper. They took seats in row 8, 2 spots off the center aisle, the perfect position to capture a wide-angle, cinematic tracking shot of an emotional walk down the aisle. 5 minutes later, Ryan and Sophie checked in under Ryan's name. They walked down the left aisle and took their seats quietly in row 3. Ryan wore a crisp, dark green button-down shirt that looked brand new, and Sophie wore simple jeans with an oatmeal-colored knit cardigan that looked slightly too big for her. Neither of them looked back at row 8. Neither of them made a sound. They just sat together, holding a single bottle of water between them, waiting. At exactly 2:05 p.m., the moderator stepped up to the microphone. Please welcome our headliner, G. Marie Jones, founder of Second Chapter Boston. The applause was warm, but as I stepped up to the polished wood podium, the room fell into an absolute breathless silence. I looked out at the sea of faces. I didn't look at Chloe. I looked at Sophie, and I began to speak. I delivered my keynote address in exactly 12 minutes, my voice low, slow, and entirely conversational, the exact cadence I use when I'm sitting with my students in our basement office. I spoke about the specific architecture of a fundamentalist exile. I told the audience about a 23-year-old girl who had been branded a thief and a fraud from a church pulpit by her own father, simply because she had won an academic scholarship funded by an estranged uncle's legacy. I spoke about how that family had weaponized a private teenage journal entry to brand her as mentally unstable and dangerous to children, just to protect their own internal narrative. I pronounced the phrase dangerous to children twice, letting the words sit in the air of Rab Hall, letting the audience feel the sheer, heavy absurdity of that label. I closed my talk with 2 sentences that I had written with Amelia Hartford. They said I should never be allowed near children, so I built a place for the children they had already broken. They thought they were burying a shameful secret, but they were actually just planting a seed. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was an absolute roar. People stood up from the green cushioned benches, their hands coming together in a rhythmic, emotional wave. And that's when Chloe made her move. She stood up in row 8, tears already flowing perfectly down her cheeks, and began walking down the center aisle toward the microphone stand, set up for the audience Q&A. Behind her, Nathan quickly stood up, angling the phone gimbal over the heads of the crowd, his finger tapping the record button to capture the definitive payoff shot for Grace and Grain. Chloe reached the microphone, her hand trembling as she held a folded piece of paper. Her voice, when it broke through the speakers, was warm, cracked in all the right places, and beautifully theatrical. "Gracie," she cried, looking up at the stage, "I am the sister she is talking about. I have spent 8 long years praying for this exact moment. We were wrong, Gracie. The family was wrong. We forgive you for leaving us, and we want you to come back home. Please, let us be a family again." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the 350 people in the hall. They turned their heads, looking back and forth between the weeping influencer in the white linen blouse and the woman standing behind the podium. I looked down at Chloe from the stage. I didn't lift the wireless microphone to my mouth. Instead, I spoke at a normal, conversational volume, letting the natural acoustics of the 1895 lecture hall carry my words over the crowd. "Thank you, ma'am," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. Forgiveness is a beautiful word, but it only works when the person offering it can actually name what was done. Before I answer you, I would like to hear from another voice in this room, someone who actually lives inside your house and has something to say about our family story. I turned my eyes to the front left section of the room and gestured gently with an open hand. "Sophie, if you're ready, the floor is yours." Chloe, frozen in the aisle, her tears stopping instantly as her 15-year-old daughter stood up from row 3. Ryan stood up right beside her, walking his daughter toward the guest podium on the left side of the stage like a bodyguard. Sophie put both hands flat on the wooden podium, her Peoria High hoodie looking completely out of place in the historic hall, but her posture was absolute granite. She didn't look at her mother. She looked directly at the center camera recording the live stream. She spoke for exactly 90 seconds. "My name is Sophie Whitaker." Her voice rang out clear and steady through the audio system. "I am 15 years old, and the woman standing in the aisle is my mother, Chloe Jones. I have been documenting the reality behind her Instagram brand for 8 months. The reunion she is trying to film right now is not real. It was sold to a corporate sponsor called Grace and Grain 3 weeks ago for $58,000. I have the contract emails." A massive collective gasp finally tore through Rab Hall. "I also have the metadata archives from October 2010, Sophie continued, her small mouth tight and precise, "where my mother explicitly admitted to stealing my Aunt Gracie's teenage diary so she could save the pages for a moment when she needed a target. That moment happened 8 years ago in Springfield, and she is trying to make it happen again today. I didn't come here to hurt my mother. I came here because I am not going to grow up inside a lie the way my aunt did." Sophie reached into the deep pocket of her oatmeal cardigan, pulled out a small blue thumb drive containing the complete Rooted and Radiant Reality archive, and placed it firmly on the moderator's table. Then she stepped away from the microphone, walked back to row 3, took her father's hand, and sat down. Chloe looked like she had been struck by lightning. The white linen blouse seemed completely drained of color. She turned around, her head down, and practically fled through the back doors of Rab Hall without looking at a single person. Nathan, his camera still awkwardly mounted on the trembling gimbal, hurried after her 7 seconds later, his face burning bright red under the fluorescent lights. The live stream didn't cut. The cameras stayed locked on the empty aisle and then slowly drifted back to the stage. I picked up my microphone, looked into the lens, and delivered the final line of the afternoon. "I did not come to this city to reveal a family. I came here to release one. Thank you for being witnesses to both." The digital collapse of my sister's empire didn't take weeks. It happened in a matter of hours. The live stream of the Reclaiming Voices Symposium reached 340,000 views within 48 hours, turning what was supposed to be a polished corporate campaign into a textbook case of digital exposure. At 3:20 a.m. on Sunday, May 10th, less than 12 hours after fleeing Rab Hall, Chloe completely deleted the @RootedAndRadiant Instagram account. It vanished from the internet, along with its 91,000 followers, its curated aesthetic prayer corners, and the entire manufactured history of a family that Sophie would no longer have to pretend to live inside. The corporate fallout was swift and absolute. At 8:14 a.m. on Monday morning, Rebecca Marrow from the Grace and Grain Talent Agency sent Chloe a 5-sentence email with the subject line, "Contract termination." The sponsorship agreement was rescinded effective immediately, with a strict directive that Chloe was not to contact the brand's executives or its board again. By Tuesday, Nathan Bellamy posted a brief, defensive Instagram story on his personal real estate account stating he was processing recent events and needed time to pray with counsel before flipping his entire profile to private. The final piece of correspondence from the Springfield Fortress arrived on Tuesday morning at 6:31 a.m. in the form of a voicemail from my mother. Her voice didn't carry any tears this time. It was tight, small, and sharp with venom. "You've disgraced us," she said. "God help you." She hung up, and for the first time in my life, the sound of her voice didn't cause a single ripple of panic in my chest. But it was the next phone call that morning, at 11:02 a.m., that finally closed the loop on my history. The caller ID read Cedar Grove Senior Living. I picked up on the second ring, and before I could even say hello, my 87-year-old grandmother spoke. Gracie, honey, sit down, Nana Eleanor said, her voice slow but completely anchored in reality. I owe you the truth about one thing that I should have said to you in the summer of 2017, and I didn't. Are you sitting? I'm sitting, Nana, I whispered. I was the one who sent those $50 money orders every month, honey, she said softly. 36 times over 3 long years. I used to drive 30 miles out of town to a post office box in Bloomington to mail them, because your daddy watched every single thing that happened in Springfield. I couldn't stop him from throwing you out, Gracie. But I never stopped choosing you. I just wanted to make sure you knew that someone in that town was always choosing you. I put one hand flat over my mouth, the tears finally breaking through as I sat in my Cambridge kitchen. For 3 years, I had assumed those monthly envelopes were an administrative oversight from my fellowship office. I had no idea that an elderly woman had been quietly defying a senior church elder in absolute secret, just to make sure I could buy my college textbooks. We stayed on the line for a full minute in absolute silence, just listening to each other breathe across the miles before she whispered, I know, baby. That's why I'm telling you now. Logistically, the pieces settled into place with a quiet, legal precision. Sophie moved into her father Ryan's house full-time on Friday, May 15th. Chloe didn't fight the custody modification paperwork through the Peoria County Family Court. She simply couldn't afford the legal fees or the public exposure anymore. On May 16th, I flew Delta from Boston to Peoria to see them. Ryan met me at the terminal in his green Ford pickup truck, which smelled honestly of sawdust and old tools. Sophie was sitting in the passenger seat, holding a bright bouquet of 6 sunflowers she had cut from her father's backyard. She handed them to me through the window, before either of us could even say hello. Sophie, it's okay, I told her, reaching out to touch her hand. You don't have to worry. I'm sorry if I moved too fast, Aunt Gracie, she said, her careful mouth finally relaxing into a genuine smile. You didn't, I said. You moved exactly the speed you needed to. The definitive resolution of my journey took place on Sunday, May 31st, 2026. Naomi and Regina hosted our weekly Sunday dinner in their Somerville apartment, just as they had been doing every single week for the last 8 years. But the wooden IKEA table wasn't long enough that night. Naomi had to drag a metal card table from the closet, attach it to one end, and throw a massive mustard-colored tablecloth over the entire setup to make room. There were 8 of us sitting at that table. Naomi and Regina were pouring the Red's sauce. Peter Callahan sat at the far corner, 63 years old, and still wearing his brown wool cardigan. Dr. Vivian Ashcraft sat beside him, freshly retired and arguing happily about poetry. Ryan Whitaker sat across from them, wearing a button-down shirt for the first time in a year, looking completely at peace. Sophie sat on my right side, eating her pasta with both hands. And at the head of the table sat Nana Eleanor, whom Ryan had personally booked, and I had paid to fly out from Illinois on a Wednesday afternoon flight so she could see the city for herself. Halfway through the meal, Sophie leaned over toward me, her voice small and careful. Aunt Gracie, can I read chapter 12 of your book now? I looked down at her, then looked at the gray canvas backpack, hanging safely on the hook by the apartment door, the same backpack I had walked out into the 91-degree heat with 8 years ago, its broken strap neatly repaired. You can read it when it comes out next spring, sweetheart, I told her, wrapping my arm around her shoulder. She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. I can wait. My father and my mother are people I will never speak to again. Not out of malice and not to punish them, but because I have finally learned that dignity requires room to breathe, and that room simply does not exist inside the house that built me. It exists entirely inside the house I built. After they asked me to come back home, I did not go back. But somewhere inside a room of 350 strangers, on a Saturday afternoon in May, a 15-year-old girl gave me the home I didn't know I was allowed to build. And that not the reveal, not the vindication, not even the truth finally spoken aloud, was the exact moment that 8 years of silence became 8 years of preparation for a life worth waiting for.